Next, from the Illinois Association of School Boards annual conference in Chicago, we hear an in-depth discussion of Illinois' pensions. We'll hear why they are underfunded and what reforms we might expect in the spring session of the legislature. This runs about 1 hour.
We have a great panel of experts here today to discuss this very important issue that has been the focus of the General Assembly, the governor, and the media this past year. We will hear from the group that is the driving force behind the push for pension reform, a representative from the teachers' retirement system who will give us an overview of the system and the impacts reform has had and could have based on various proposals. And hopefully the chairman of the Senate Pensions and Investments Committee who will talk to us about the various proposals on the table and what he anticipates for 2012 session. A little bit of housekeeping first. We're going to have each speaker speak for a little bit of time, and then we're going to have time for question and answer at the end. Pension reform has been a part of the budget discussions at the Capitol for the past several years. That's because when the budgeteers take a look at what the drivers of the budget deficit are, the answer is often pensions and Medicaid. Medicaid reform was signed into law in January, and that leaves pensions still on the table. The legislators did pass some pension reform in March of 2010, but it was only for new employees. In an unprecedented move, the General Assembly passed the legislation in both chambers in 11 hours. And the governor signed the legislation a few weeks later, and the effective date was January 1st, 2011. Anyone hired after that date is in what is now called Tier 2. The legislation affects all public employees except for police and firefighters. And the changes included increasing the retirement age from 62 in most cases to 67, changing how the initial pension annuity was calculated, and eliminating the 3% compounded cost of living raises. The Illinois Commission on Government Forecasting and Accountability, the legislature's independent research agency, estimated that the 5 state pension plans covering state employees, university employees, teachers and administrators, judges, and members of the General Assembly, that this legislation collectively would save $976 million in the first fiscal year after the pension reform. That put a dent in the $85.6 billion unfunded liability the state systems have, but many felt it was not enough. And I prepared my remarks for my opening statement earlier this week, and then just a few days ago, we heard that the total pension payment for this fiscal year that the legislature is going to be considering starting in January is going to be $7.4 billion. That's $1 billion over what they were anticipating. Again, the Commission on Budget Forecasting and Accountability, they expect that total revenues are going to grow about $1.3 billion next fiscal year, and so the increase in the pension payment pretty much eats that up. And as expected, Medicaid costs are expected to go up about $700 to $800 million, and then again with that 2% revenue growth. Yesterday, there was a hot topic session, and there were some legislators there, and one of the senators said something that was really interesting. He asked his staff, he said, you know, can you come up with, for me, what is the problem? What's the problem with the pension system? And his staff came up with kind of a breakdown of what they felt the problem was. And they said that approximately 45% is the result of the General Assembly not paying. About 30% is a result of perks that were added but not paid for. And then the last 25% is kind of a split between the fact that people don't die as soon as they're supposed to according to the system, and then investments have done poorly because of the economy. And again, with that pension payment, that $7.4 billion, what is that? What is that paying for? About 70% of that is makeup from non-payment or a lower payment from the General Assembly, and about 30% of that is current costs, which they call normal costs. Another piece of the puzzle that was also signed into law in January is the ever unpopular income tax increase. Several legislators expressed concern about voting for the income tax increase if the state was going to end up in the same position several years down the road. And it seems that those legislators had a pretty good point, because even with the income tax in effect, the state backlog of bills is still at $3.7 billion. And then there's always the question of whether any change to current employees' pensions is constitutional. So we have a lot of issues to discuss, so let's get our discussion going. First, I would like to introduce Rich Frankenfeld. He's with the Teachers Retirement System. Rich began his career as a junior high school math teacher. In the early 80s, he served as a Springfield Education Association president. He was a lobbyist for the IEA from 1982 to 2005, and he retired from the IEA as the Director of Governmental Relations. He is currently the Director of Outreach for the Teachers Retirement System, which means he serves as a liaison between the stakeholders and TRS. And he also assists the staff in the development of TRS. So please join me in welcoming Rich Frankenfeld.
Thank you, Susan. I was just commenting to a few folks. I was invited to speak last year at this time, and I made about 100 copies of the presentation, and there were about 50 people in the room. So I ended up taking a few back with me. Unfortunately, today, it looks like there's a few more than 100 here, so I will get to Susan the copies of my presentation. She can put it on the web and you can pick it up that way. I'm not going to go through the entire packet. I would be happy to talk to you about aspects of the packet. One thing I want to point out is traditionally when we do these things, a member stands up and says, "Tell me about my retirement." This is not what I do. We have a full-fledged group of counselors that go out into the field, that talk with our folks back in Springfield and Lisle. But if you do have a question about your personal situation, drop me a note. The last page of this packet would be an opportunity to do that if you have a packet. Otherwise, just drop me a note. You can get I'll leave my email address up there for a minute before Dee speaks. I'm going to talk about the first two topics: background on TRS and the Tier 2 system. For those of you who don't know, our system was created in 1939 by an act of the General Assembly. It is for teachers outside the city of Chicago. Anybody have any idea when the city of Chicago created a retirement program for their school employees and municipal employees? Well, prior to the 1900s, they created a local system based on local property taxes that was funded in the city of Chicago. Right now we have over 166,000 active members, over 100,000 annuitants and beneficiaries, with our oldest retiree 108. She turned 108 last month. Our average retiree annuity is $3,800 a month. That translates into $46,000 a year. And you will notice by this chart that almost 60% are earning an annuity less than $50,000 a year. And I think by most standards, you would not deem this as an overly generous system. Who pays for it? Well, in our system, the investment income accounts for about 50% of our revenue, and this is over a 20-year period of time. This is actual revenue. Active members, like many of you here, providing 22% of the cost. The state of Illinois providing about 25% of the cost, and school districts providing about 4% of the cost. That 4% is somewhat new. It came about as a result of 2.2 legislation. There was I used to say a small contribution from school districts, but I recognize that nothing these days is indeed small to local school districts. Just to give you an idea, in fiscal year 10, the Chicago Teachers Public Pension System received about a little less than 20% of their revenue in fiscal year 10 from the school district, local property taxes, if you will, and they had received 2.2% from the state of Illinois, just to kind of give you a comparison of the two. As you know, we do not participate in Social Security on your teaching salary, your administrative salary. However, if you had earned credit in Social Security, maybe you were a soda jerk prior to going to work, maybe you were did some part-time stuff in the summer and picked up some additional hours, whatever. But as a result of some legislation that was passed at the federal level many years ago, that limited annuity that you're going to get is going to be reduced anywhere from 40 to 60%. Also on the Medicare side, new employees after March 31st of 1996 are now paying Medicare. Senator, how are you? In terms of shared cost, teachers are paying, and school employees that participate in TRS are paying 9.4% of their salary, 9.4% of their salary to the system. If you were to start a new system today, or if you were to ask what is the cost of that benefit, or what should the employer side pay for that benefit, the answer would be 8.4% for those sets of benefits. In other words, for the set of benefits that we currently have, active members are currently paying more than half the cost of their pension system. Now, what is this other side of the equation? Well, that's payment on the unfunded. And as you're probably all aware, the General Assembly and the various governors have not always funded the pension systems as they should. And the bulk of that, interest on the unfunded, payment on the unfunded, is a direct result of the underfunding that has occurred for several years. Just to give you an idea on our investment results at the end of June 30th, 2010 were over 13%. At the end of 2011, over 24%. Now, our pension system is not an annual pension system. While these are good, we certainly need to look much more long-term in terms of how the system is doing. And this chart is meant to give you that perspective, that over a 30-year period of time, our system has earned 9.3% investment return on our members' money. Now, in 1995, the General Assembly and the governor at the time signed a new pension funding law into place. And it did several things. First, it required to be 90% funded, 90% to be actuarially funded by 2045. And I can remember thinking, well, that's a long time off. I'll never see it. And I may still never see it. However, they recognized right from the get-go that they couldn't do the actuarial funding. That was a given, if you will, and that was written into the legislation. There was like a 15-year ramp, it was called, which basically says we're not going to fund you at actuarial soundness, we're going to fund you on a different formula and gradually increase it so that by 2011, here we are, 2011 we'd be back on the actuarial side. So now we're getting into the actuarial side. It really isn't a surprise that when the General Assembly hadn't funded it, even in the ramp, that we're at the point where we are today. It also did this through a continuing appropriation. And we were told that this meant that we were going to get our money regardless, because it would be a continuing appropriation not required of the General Assembly. Well, we've seen for the last couple of years, continuing appropriation doesn't mean that the money has been released by the governor and/or comptroller. In June of 2005, before we got to about halfway through the ramp, the General Assembly decided to have a pension holiday. And they reduced the ramp number, not the actuarial number, the ramp number by $2.3 billion for fiscal year 06 and 07. They were back on track in fiscal year 08, and they were back on track in fiscal year 09. In fiscal year 10, they came up with another way of funding the system, and that was through pension obligation bonds or notes. That's a system where they sold notes on the open market at a certain interest rate, and 2 weeks later, all the retirement systems had their money from that. I guess that's the good news. The bad news, obviously, is somebody has to pay that debt. The same thing happened in fiscal 11. And in fiscal year 12, we went back to the appropriation process, and we are a month and a half or so behind the schedule this fiscal year. Now, most of you in the room, if the General Assembly and the Governor's Office and the Comptroller were to tell you that you were only going to be a month and a half behind on your payments from the state, you would gladly accept that. Let me talk a little bit about the two-tiered system that was put in place in 2010. It is for all TRS members and others hired on or after January 1st of 2011. It affects 13 different systems. One of the major components was it changed the retirement age. The normal retirement age in our system in Tier 1 is age 60 or 35 years of service, and it changed it to 67. In our system, to compute one's pension under the formula, it is a 4-year average for Tier 1. For these folks, it will be an 8-year average. It capped salaries. It capped salaries that would be pensionable by an index that gradually increases over time. Right now, it's about $108,000. Everything above that $108,000 would not be pensionable, you would not get credit, and you would not pay into TRS on that increased number. And this has been a topic of discussion very recently, because one of the reasons that the state university system cited for their increase in their recommendation, and they increased the greatest over last year, was that this is the first time they have calculated in a capped salary for those new faculty members over a period of time. When you do that in the short term, you reduce the money coming into the system. And when you do that, under our current funding plan, who picks up the difference? The state of Illinois. And that certainly is a topic today. The post-retirement increase for our Tier 1 members are 3%. This was adjusted downward to be 3% or half the cost of living. The survivor benefit, some say surprisingly, but it was increased. You have to remember, however, it is on a much smaller base. They also added double dipping provisions, a prohibition for these people hired after January 1st of this year of working in another governmental body in a full-time basis. And when this was going through the General Assembly at one of the hearings, we testified that the cost of this program is not going to be 9.4%, which the members are charged, it's going to be somewhere in the 4.5%, 5% range, 6% range, somewhere in there. So these folks are clearly paying not only the entire cost, the employee and employer share, they're also paying a little bit more for the rest of us to fund our current program. Some of the issues that are coming up, we'll leave that for the rest of the panel. I know Dee wants to talk about their proposal to address this issue.
Thank you, Rich. Next, I'd like to introduce Dee Meyer. She currently serves as the Executive Vice President of the Civic Committee of the Commercial Club of Chicago, kind of a mouthful, the nonprofit organization of senior executives of the major businesses in the Chicagoland region. The organization's mission is to improve the economic and social well-being of the Chicago area. She also serves on the State of Illinois P20 Council and the Board of Directors of the Academy for the Urban School Leadership. She previously served on the Illinois Board of Higher Education and the Joint Education Committee from 1998 to 2007, the advisory boards of the Illinois Education Research Council, Catalyst Magazine, and the Chicago 2016 Committee. She has been involved in numerous state and local task forces and initiatives related to her policy work with the Civic Committee. Okay, so please join me in welcoming Dee Meyer.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about the Civic Committee, which is, as indicated, the nonprofit of the senior executives of the major organizations in the region. The Commercial Club has been around since 1877, helped work on the Burnham Plan and the like, and we ended up getting into this whole issue of pension reform at the request of the Chicago Public Schools really back in 2006. We've been involved, I was Chief of Staff to the Eikenberry Commission. We've been involved in various school reform efforts, both in the city as well as on the state level. And CPS was coming to us and saying, you know, would you guys back looking at providing increased resources to the Chicago Public Schools, where we spend a lot of our time. So we formed a task force chaired by a fellow by the name of Jim Farrell, the former CEO and chairman of Illinois Tool Works, which is one of the state's big companies. And we brought in folks from all over the state, various other national experts, and ended up releasing a report known as Facing Facts. And this was at the end of 2006. And at that point, what we realized was that Illinois' financial situation was dire, and that the quote was, Illinois was headed towards financial implosion, and that what came to be is that at that point pension liability was $42 billion. It is now $85 billion. And so what we have done when we released that report, we met with people, we talked with TRS, we had meetings with all the unions, we met with legislators and the like, and continue to spread the word, which I'll talk a little bit about. And then we had the Great Recession, the Great Fall in the stock market, and then we released the update of Facing Facts in 2009. Which had shown the dramatic change on where Illinois was. And that I think one important point that I ask all of you to think about as we're looking at this is what we're trying to do is a variety of things, but it's in my presentation, but I think it's an important place to begin, is we love the state of Illinois, and our goal is that we have a thriving, functional state that provides high-quality services to the children through education, all the expectations that we expect from state and local governments, that the pensions that have been in place are funded, and that everything that everyone has earned to date is protected and funded. and that going forward we're in a position that Illinois can compete successfully for people to locate businesses here and provide a livelihood for our citizens. So with that, I want to just take a little bit of time and give you an overview of how we came to the notion that looking at the pension and retirement obligations of the state are something that we need to do, recognizing a lot of the issues that are involved. So first off, our goal here is really to save the pensions, and I want to make that clear. So, but here is where we are as a state. Illinois has $17 billion in general obligation bonds. You're looking at another $7 billion, depending upon the timing of unpaid bills that the state has. And if you look, that left-hand portion of the screen is really related to what you would normally expect, other than the unpaid bills, of a state to have. And on the right-hand side, these are the obligations that we have that are associated with retirement programs for state and teacher employees. You're looking at an $85 billion unfunded liability on the part of the pensions, $44 billion related to retirement programs for state employees, $13 billion of pension obligation bonds, and then another $4 billion of the other pension borrowing from this year. This puts Illinois as one of the highest states in terms of obligations related to retirement programs, and has had a negative impact in the viewing of how we are looked across the country. The Pew Center of the state, which is considered a very reputable organization, has done a few pension studies looking at what states have the best funded pensions, which ones need to be able to address things. New York, for example, has a very high funded pension, whereas Illinois is actually the worst funded pension system in the country. And if you look at it, we have some fairly optimistic assumptions in terms of what the growth rate in terms of returns and otherwise, which could potentially be viewed as could be even worse than it currently is. So we're looking at, in 2010, at 38% funding.
I'll get you later, bro.
And so it was sort of talking about this is why is it that we look at this as an important issue? Right now, there's a CEO magazine survey that ranks states as places to do business. Illinois has dropped from 8th to 48th in the last 6 years. And obviously this is, attributed to a number of different issues. But, obviously the governors and where they are living at this point, the current pension debt, the ability, I think one of the real issues is the notion of uncertainty and being able to address some of the really, really deep issues that we have financially. We have, according to Moody's, we have the worst bond rating. And that affects our ability to access the capital markets, get the type of money we need to be able to operate our state. We're second worst under S&P and the others. We have 4 more ticks to non-investment grade, which is horrible. I tried to find out whether or not anyone else had been in the Bs. I think Louisiana way back when. We talked about the pension. We've lost, the National Tax Foundation has recently released a study which tracks income within states, and that Illinois over the last decade, due to outmigration, lost $20 billion of income that could be used to help pay for a lot of the services that we're looking at. In addition, we have a 10% unemployment rate in September, which is obviously, it's higher than the national average, and it continues to be of great concern. I think, all of this says we have to be able to address some of our deep-seated financial issues to be able to be successful and provide for our people. One of the points that Rich talked about was the 95 law, and what are the implications of that law as we look at funding the debt. I mean, a lot of the obligation that he talked about is the unfunded liabilities that is currently being amortized over the next several years. And what this chart does, and he also talked about this notion of capped payroll. And this pension stuff is complicated, but that as part of the Tier 2 bill that was passed, it did cap payroll at 1,068. And so what it means is that you have to fund up front more than you would in the later years. The other ones assumes uncapped payroll growing at 4.4 depending upon which system on average. But what this shows you is that right now you're looking at about 25% of the big three revenues. This is a chart that we worked with the Taxpayers Federation with. 25% of the big three revenues, that's corporate, personal income, and sales tax, are going to be needed, are currently being needed to pay our pension debts. That's both the normal cost, which is the annual obligation, as well as the pension debt that is currently out there, that $85 billion of unfunded liability. And what you look at is over time, and the red mark is current law, that's not including the cap payroll. That's what has historically been there. But what it's showing you is that over time you're getting to a point where you're looking at 45% of the big three revenues will have to go to fund these pension systems. And that means you're going to have to crowd out other issues such as school funding, transportation, care for the poor, a lot of different issues. And that this also, I need to clarify, also assumes that the tax increase that is supposed to be temporary actually remains permanent. If that tax increase remains as current law, then these obligations will be a higher percentage of those big three revenues. And then the other issue is, and the way that the law was funded, the law was structured in '95 is that you end up with continuing the low funding ratios of the pension funds over time by the way the nature of the amortization. So you remain in the 40% range for a long period of time. And one of the concerns about these low funding ratios are a couple-fold. One is that, as we indicated, between '06 and '11, the unfunded liability virtually doubled. And you end up in a situation where the lower the funding, you have less resiliency to survive economic downturn and a lack of return on the investment. And in addition, one of the other issues that the funds are facing is that there is, in comparison to history, if you think about the aging of the baby boomers, while we may have the same number of teachers that teaching, give or take, fairly stable, would you say, over the last period of time? Probably.
Yeah, I think it's gone up a little.
But the vast majority of the issue, as he talking about people living longer, is that there are fewer people within the system to be able to pay for the longer group of people. There's a ratio that people do that show that, the more people that are retired versus those that are active to be able to support it puts more strain on the system. But what you're looking at under current law is you've got a harder period of time going forward to be able to withstand some of that turbulence. And what we talked about before is you end up in a situation right now where you have assets on hand that are less than the benefits that have been promised to, or that are expected to employees and retirees. And this is an issue that we need to remedy because it's not something that's sustainable over time. Here are a list of questions. These are ones that we have suggested, sort of on the same range of how do we address these issues to be able to be effective, to be able to deal with the needs that are out there in terms of the pension plans. And here, as I go back to the pension, as we look at it, these are our goals. Protect the benefits that our current retirees are depending on, protect the benefits of current employees have earned to date, while providing a more sustainable plan going forward. As we look at the plan as currently configured, both the Tier 1 and the Tier 2 as currently structured are unsustainable to be able to address the issues that we face as a state. Improve the benefit contribution package offered to new employees. What we suggested under the revised 512 bill, which has been out there, is that some of the pieces that Rich talked about as the problems of the bill are problems. I mean, it's a program that's put in place that right now people are putting in their 9.4%. The benefit may be worth 11, 12. And that what we have said is scale that back, make it 50-50 state and employee. So it's 6% employee, 6% state. take that pension base, which currently is at 106.8, which is the Social Security wage base, have that grow with CPI over time so that it ends up growing and is actually a 12% benefit. The way the law is currently structured, the contributions go up, contributions are going up and the value to the employee is going down. And it ends up being a situation where the employee ends up paying all, as opposed to one which we think is a sustainable benefit for employees, in which the state pays 50% and the employees pays 50%. In addition, there are other concerns about the current structure of Tier 2 as whether or not, as it becomes employee pay all, that it would potentially throw the state into Social Security. And what we've said is have it grow. At no point should the benefit be less than Social Security. And remember, Social Security is really expected to be a 45% benefit, whereas this is expected to be much higher. And then the other piece is let's provide a way of addressing this pension system on a sustainable basis. You know, I was talking to Rich when we were working on school funding back in the 90s and they passed that pension bill, and shame on all of us. I remember seeing a ramp and thinking, how in God's name are we going to do it? And yet, here we are, and we came out with our report in 2006. The reality is we always, I think the reality is that we have this huge obligation that we have to find a way to deal with on a sustainable basis that allows us to be able to assure the benefits that have been earned to date, but also provide the resources that are needed for our state, as well as something for the taxpayers so that the taxpayers aren't being asked to continue to increase their income tax. And also the state creditworthiness. To have our state be the worst in the nation really has a huge impact. I mean, I can tell you, one of the fellows I work with, and I'm not, you know, is companies are making decisions not to come to Illinois. And they're making decisions not to stay here. And it's not getting a lot, I mean, outside of some of the ones that are getting attention, and we can all leave that someplace, but that the reality is that people are making decisions every day. I sat in one group meeting and he said, look, I had a choice of, they had a 250-person operation. It was an ag tech company. And it was between Illinois, Indiana, and Iowa. And they said, they knocked Illinois out very quickly in light of this increasing obligations that are out there and the inability of our state to actually effectively come up with a strategy of how we're going to get ourselves out. I think a lot of it is, and sort of one of the reasons we've been pushing to get this done quickly is our image is so bad that as a state that can't move. We're not addressing it. It's not saying, we have these 5, 10 issues, and this is our plan to be able to address it. We have to get to that point to be able to stop the bleeding. Okay. And this talks about what Rich has already talked about, the differences between the state plan currently and the pension plan that was passed, and also the private sector. Private sector, on average, is at 65 right now. As with everybody else, they're moving to 67 with Social Security wage base. Okay, Senate Bill 512. At this point, you guys have probably heard and read a lot about it, or different things about it. And what I want to do is kind of clarify any questions you have and sort of set it out. The goal is that this would apply to both current and new employees, and it doesn't affect current retirees at all, other than it works to fund the system in a better way so that the monies will be there for those that are retired. The current Tier 1 defined benefit plan, what it does is it gives you employees 3 choices. You can choose to stay in the plan that you have to date, and everything you've earned to date is untouched. And going forward, it's saying, going forward, whatever you've earned to date is there. Going forward, you have a choice. You can stay in the same plan, but you have to increase your contribution. Secondly, you can move to the revised Tier 2, as I already indicated, which has a 6% contribution and has now a growing base. And then you can go to a self-managed plan, which is basically a 401k style plan. Now, how many of you on your local districts have separate self-managed plans that you administer or you have? my understanding is a lot of people have them. And so the goal of all this is that the state contribution is at 6% regardless of plan. And so what it does is it encapsulates what the state obligation is for that. New employees are given a choice of the new revised Tier 2 or the self-managed plan. Then one of the really important pieces is the state takes the 85 billion or 80 billion, depending upon whether you're smoothed or unsmoothed, and various other technicalities. But what the state does is, our proposal originally was the state had to do a straight line amortization. Just take it, do it over 2045, and just do it straight, just like a mortgage. The leaders didn't like that. But what we were trying to do was find one that was much more attainable than the current ramp that goes up like this, that you're looking at 40 to 50, or depending upon whether you have a tax increase, even higher. And so what we came up with is novel, and it's different than other points, but it really ends up being a percentage of the big three taxes. Under current structure, most of the pension funds, on average, are assuming a 4.4% growth rate. Depends on which fund. But what that does is it ends up back-end loading, and it's really hard to figure out what the contributions are going to be, hence sort of the certification issues we're having this year. What we're saying is allocate basically between 25 and 30% of the big three revenues that goes to amortize that 85 billion. And what that 85 billion is that that's all those retirement benefits that you guys have earned. And it's assuring that it gets done on a regular basis. And so the goal of it is it puts the system on a much more even keel in terms of addressing it. Example using a COGFA study that was recently out. If you look at this, the light blue is where the funding would be, the state contributions would be going into these different funds. And so you're looking at a much lower growth rate over time, and it puts it in a situation where it's visible, and it's also much more sustainable over time. The big dark red is under current law. What you'll be looking at, you're looking at about $14 billion. And then the capped, the one on the left is the capped payroll. Since that's a big issue this week, we put it in. But that's basically on a system we don't think is sustainable and is in no one's advantage. So as we are looking at this, we look at the light blue and the red. This also addresses the funding ratio. If you look at the blue, the fund rate, the more you fund up front, the better. The hardest part about the current system, there are two big key drivers. It's retirement age and longevity, and it's COLAs. And so the more you can fund up front, given the 8.2% assumed return, the better you are. So I think in summary, basically I've summarized our goals on the system. We try to address a lot of things simultaneously within pensions, which is not always easy. We are trying to ensure that everything that everybody earned to date is funded, because we actually believe that it's very precarious. The notion that as I look at our biggest risk is the state either doesn't fund or lowly funds what's currently on that ramp. And that puts the systems in a much more precarious position than they are right now. And that it's going to be really tough to be able to get to 40 to 50% of revenues and not figure out what you're going to cut. And so sort of if you heard about the reactions to the crowding out, the increase in the contributions because of the changes in SURS cap payroll, TRS did it first last year, but that's the beginning of the crowding out discussion, whether for whichever reason, but that's the type of issue that's going to continue to confront us if we don't address it. So those are our comments. I'm looking at Senator Raoul, who I can tell is going to talk about constitutionality. We have a position that we do believe that this is constitutional going forward. We say that everything you've earned to date, whether it's COLA or otherwise, you have. So I'll leave it with that, and I appreciate the opportunity. We're happy to talk at any point We have met with a variety of people across the different spectrums in this discussion. You know, as we've said, we're happy to have others' ideas. The goal is to get this addressed, because if we don't, we're going to be in a really tough spot. And the goal is that people get their retirements. Thank you.
He is a senator of the 13th Legislative District and is a lifelong resident of Hyde Park in the Kenwood area. He was elected in 2004. He was tapped to fill the vacancy left by former State Senator Barack Obama's election to the U.S. Senate. He is the chairman of the Senate's Pension and Investments Committee, and he is also the chairman of the Redistricting Committee. He's the vice chair of the Criminal Law Committee as a former prosecutor. He's also a member of the committees on Judiciary, Consumer Protection, and Telecommunications and Technology. His top legislative priorities are education, economic development, and tourism. So please join me in welcoming Senator Raoul.
So, some 7 years ago, when I was appointed to the Senate, I had a conversation with the former Senate president, who said he was going to create a standing pensions and investment committee, and I said to him, "Oh, that sounds interesting. Would you allow for a freshman to serve on that committee?" He says, "Are you a financial professional?" I said, "No, I'm a lawyer. I can learn anything." And it landed me on the Pensions and Investment Committee as the vice chair at the time, and then the chair ascended to a leadership position, and I got vacuumed up to being the chair of the Pensions and Investment Committee. So I'm not a financial services professional by any means, and the two previous speakers are more well-versed as to assessing the pathway to solvency than I am, and I concede that. What I'd like to focus my remarks on are processing. Both process in how we speak out about things publicly, as well as process as to how we negotiate ourselves to solvency, as well as the Constitution, as mentioned. And I should say that my predecessor, who's now the president, taught constitutional law at the University of Chicago, and I did not. So I'm not by any means a constitutional scholar, but I do know that our Constitution, as compared to many state constitutions across the nation, has a couple of clauses in it that are problematic towards the, with regards to the legislature trying to do something unilaterally to change benefit structure for current employees. There is both the contractual clause as well as the anti-diminishment clause with regards to the pension system. And there have been legal memorandums that have been exchanged back and forth, a little ping pong game going on there. And our chief legal counsel, Eric Madeir, has even written a pretty lengthy law review article that speaks to the issue. And I've had the opportunity to look at some of the documents that and correspondence during the Constitutional Convention that were being exchanged, and it was clear that both because of what was happening the years leading up to the Constitutional Convention, as well as to what was being exchanged during the Constitutional Convention, they anticipated this day. And so it was clear as to what was being contemplated when the language was put in. There were folks who were warning, well, you are going to tie the hands of the legislature. So what does that mean? Does that mean that nothing can be done? I don't think that that's the conclusion that we reach. Again, I said the legislature cannot unilaterally change the circumstances. It's my belief that that is the case. I mean, we recently passed legislation that dealt with some of the abuses of union officials, double dipping, using service credit while serving as a union official towards the, there was particular abuse by IFT union officials working one day to be able to earn the benefits of the TRS system. And so I may sound somewhat inconsistent because what we did in that legislation, and I sponsored 2 pieces of legislation, both of which came over from the House. One where Karen May was, Representative Karen May was a sponsor, that was prospective legislation dealing going forward, and one that was retroactive, saying that, you know, we will refund any investments made into the system with any investment gains, but we're not going to allow for that double dipping to take place. So how am I able to say that we can legislatively, arguably, diminish these benefits with what I just said about the Constitution? Well, the Constitution also says that public funds should not be used for something that's not in the public good. And that is the hook that we hang our hat upon, that distinguishes itself from reducing the benefits of current employees that have not done anything that is not in the public good. So while some may argue the recent actions of the legislature demonstrate that the legislature can in fact go back and retroactively change benefits, I would argue otherwise because of the other constitutional provision that protects against public funds not being used in the public good. So what is the implication of the legislature not being able to unilaterally do things? It's a contractual relationship. And I did get an A in contracts in my in law school, and you know, modification has to be agreed upon by the parties, and that's part of the focus, as I talked about, the focus of the dialogue that has occurred both in public speaking as well as in radio ads and so forth, the sound bites that people have latched on to, 95% of the public paying for 5% of the public and things of that nature. It sends a message that the many public employees, many of whom are teachers, did something wrong, took advantage of the public at large, and I can no sooner point the finger at the teachers and the public employees of this state. I can't do that before pointing the finger at myself as a member of the Illinois legislature, albeit I've only been around for 7 years, but even within that 7 years, we were irresponsible as a state government in not making the full payment. And going back for decades, we failed to recognize a structural deficit And so as we evaluate this and as we look at this and as we discuss this, we need to discuss all of those things in a manner where it's not seeming like we're blaming the folks that did not have much to do with getting us to the point that we are today. It's a dangerous discussion because it forces, it takes place in a form where people they're not seeing the full PowerPoint presentations from both sides. They're not reading the legal memorandum with regards to the constitutional challenges that we have. They're just listening to the sound bites. And those sound bites thereby create a pressure for us to rush and do something that may be unconstitutional, that may not shepherd us to solvency, may be described to shepherding us to solvency, but may not shepherd us to solvency. When a bilateral discussion involving the folks involved on both sides should be called for and should take place. That calls upon the executive branch of government to take a greater leadership role in shepherding us to solvency of our pension funds and solvency of the state in general. And you can't look at the pension fund solvency in isolation, because the reason why there have been skip payments is because we've been doing just that. We've been looking at things in isolation instead of looking at the fact that it costs to provide state services, and there are tough decisions to make. And it's interesting how the discussion around pension reform has evolved and how different things have been grasped to make the argument. And those who have been pushing for reforms such as 512 have now been advocates for human services from the time that I came in the legislature. I've got a diverse constituency. With every decision I make, there are people who love me for it and there are people who dislike me for it. Notwithstanding the fact that it's not a popular thing to say, I want to raise your taxes, I've been saying it from the outset. Not because I just want to raise folks' taxes, because I know on a per capita basis, head count-wise, we have one of the leanest state governments in the nation. That as I sat on the, I can't remember the name of the committee, Bill Holland's committee, and we were assessing the Department of Human Services and the deficiencies, the findings against the Department of Human Services and other departments, we were discovering that a lot of those findings came about as a result of understaffing. And so we have to make a decision, what kind of services do we want government to provide? To what extent do we want government to provide those services? We have to remove the dependency on certain drivers of the economy in certain parts of the state. You know, the reality is we can move towards having less correctional facilities and other facilities within the state, and we have to make some hard decisions about those things and create other alternatives for those parts of the state that depend on those facilities to drive their local economy. We've got to do all of these things comprehensively and not in isolation say 95% of the people are paying for the pension benefits of 5% of the state, ignoring introducing to that conversation what happened with the course of the past 30 years with regards to our structural deficit. So what do we do? I had a conversation with the executive director of CSRS recently, and one of the things that he mentioned to me is that the universities need to take a leadership role and come to the table. School districts need to take a leadership role and come to the table, and there has to be a bilateral discussion towards a solution. On the local level, Mayor Emanuel needs to take a leadership role, and there has to be a bilateral discussion, and it can't be legislature rush this through the veto session and expect to solve the problem. Particularly if a piece of legislation is likely to be found unconstitutional, and we'll be back to square one, and depending on how long that takes to go through the legal system, I imagine it would be expedited to avoid any negative consequences from beginning down a path that we cannot continue. So it is my suggestion that if we're to recognize a contract to be a contract, we have to modify that contract like we modify any contracts with the parties to the contract both being involved in that discussion.
You're watching the Illinois Channel, an independent nonprofit corporation formed to provide gavel-to-gavel coverage of Illinois state government and other public affairs events taking place across Illinois.